Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Poverty Alliance's third webinar in our series, our Build Back Better webinar series. My name is Peter Kelly. I'm Director of the Poverty Alliance. For those of you who don't know or who are new to the Poverty Alliance is the national anti-poverty network in Scotland, bringing together grassroots organisations, voluntary organisations, trade unions, faith groups, a whole range of civil society to campaign and to take action against poverty. And I think we're in a particularly challenging time at the moment, and that's why we're running this series of webinars where we want to look at, when we come out of this crisis, how are we trying to change things? How do we get out of this crisis with a new impetus to tackle the poverty, the inequality that scars our society? Today, our focus is on issues around disability and rights, and what we learn from perhaps our current response and the current experience of disabled people in the response to COVID-19, and what we can do practically and and also in policy terms to make sure that we address some of the problems that disabled people entered this crisis with, and how we can genuinely build back better. We've got some great speakers with us today. We have Tressa Burke from Glasgow Disability Alliance, Chloe True from the Scottish Human Rights Commission, and Dr. Sally Witcher from Inclusion Scotland. We're recording today's webinar, so if you experience any technical problems, the webinar will be recorded and will eventually be posted on the Poverty Alliance's website. I would encourage you to ask questions during the webinar using the question and answer function that should be available to you. And this is just one of a series of webinars that we're carrying out over the next couple of months to try and create momentum, to try and open up the space for discussion about what we need to do better coming out of this crisis. So now I'm going to hand over to Tressa Burke, Director of the Glasgow Disability Alliance. Tressa is going to start with a short video, and hopefully you're ready to join us now, Tressa. Over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. It looks like it's going to be a good session, and looking forward to hearing from Chloe and from Sally too. And hopefully between us we'll provide a good overview of how the coronavirus and society's response to it has had an impact on disabled people, what it has meant and what it will mean going forward, and what needs to happen, what needs to change basically to make sure that the rights and experiences of disabled people are at the heart of recovery. And specifically, I'm going to speak about the response of Glasgow Disability Alliance. And before I do that, I'm going to show a wee film. So that's a wee bit different from the usual light-hearted tone which the Purple Poncho players always have in their performances, usually quite a lot of humour. It's always powerful and challenging, but it does usually have a lot of laughs. But COVID or coronavirus hasn't been a lot of laughs for disabled people, or for many, many of us. It's been about life and death and loss and fear for each and every one of us. We at GDA have actually lost a number of members to COVID, and far more are affected by the inequalities that it has supercharged. We ran an event on Friday with 130 disabled GDA members called Same Storm, Different Boats, to recognise that lockdown isn't the same for everyone. Not everybody's set up to survive in the same way. Now, we recognise that it wasn't easy for anybody, but we also know that poorer people, lone parents, older people, black and minority ethnic people, and of course disabled people were much, much worse off and still are. So too were asylum seekers and refugees, those facing addictions and homelessness. As the sketch powerfully highlights, disabled people were already in a bad situation, a human catastrophe, the UN's words, not ours. Poverty, cuts to benefits, access to a whole range of things were our starting point, and that was before COVID. So what did GDA do and what did we learn? Well, we've done a lot, like many others, and just before lockdown we came up with a plan to check in with our 5,000 members to find out how they were coping and what we could do to help, or how we could signpost them and who else might be able to help them. and we're still making our way through, having made 4,500 calls. I'm going to show a few slides just to give you something to look at apart from my big ball heat. So I'll do this again if I can manage it. Bear with me. So here's some of what we've done. So 4,500 wellbeing check-in calls, 15,000 letters, 2,000 detailed survey responses, that's on SurveyMonkey, 100 people supported by our new wellbeing service, 504, and this was a couple of weeks ago at that point, people had received deliveries, that's our kind of food and medication and lifeline responses. 100 people supported through our welfare rights team, 200 people brought online, and some of them for the first time. And I'll talk about that in a minute. We got a grant to help us get kit and get people coaching to hook them up. Disabled people contributing over 1,500 hours, speaking about their experiences and their concerns. 345 people have received digital support calls, and 149 have signed up to receive coaching or to get the equipment. And here is what we learned so far anyway. So 55% have been worried about food, money, medication, 80% not aware of local services or services that they could access, 41% struggling to access information in the formats that they need, and all the contradictory advice coming for the 4 nations at the same time, 73% worried about isolation, and 90% worried about their physical or mental health, or both. So COVID has supercharged the inequalities that were already faced by disabled people, and the pandemic responses have created new inequalities and left disabled people behind. Oh, let's jump to the next slide. And recovery and renewal risks leaving disabled people even further behind unless we supercharge disabled people's involvement every step of the way. So this is some of the kind of things that disabled people have said. I'm not going to read it all out, but just a kind of couple of things. Feeling of hopelessness, to find that the society that was meant to care for me has let me down, and GDA has helped me feel part of a community again instead of feeling isolated and alone. And a number of people have told us that GDA is the only approach that they've had to check to see how they're doing, which is very worrying because many of our members are shielding and do have shielding letters, so we're not sure how that's happened. And many more actually are not shielding and are at high risk and have fallen through the gaps. So the inequalities have been supercharged in many ways. Poverty, mental health has been terribly affected, and health too, social care cuts and exclusion. Food has been obviously in great demand, and queues and attitudes in shops have been difficult. I won't read all of these things, but some of the food banks closing in the early day, and I know everybody's trying their best and just dealing with what they have to, but money, people not having access to their own cash, increased costs to food and to bills, people having to be in the house all the time, heating bills go up, all the other bills go up. Welfare rights, so we know that there has been a reduction of from 13,000 I think per week to 5,000 PIP claims, so people are obviously struggling to get the access they need, and things have been held up as well. Rights to care threatened by DNR, people being phoned up, and that stands for do not recover, do not resuscitate, sorry, people's GPs phoning and asking them if they would cooperate with non-treatment or not to go to hospital in the event that they become ill, and these are not necessarily people who are at end of life stage. Appointments being cancelled, obviously all the routine appointments and screenings being cancelled, people's conditions getting worse, people feeling that they're very inactive and that's having an impact on their health. They can't keep as active and moving as they need to for their condition. Of course, extreme isolation as well. And user-led organisations getting really good feedback from our members that we've spoken to. So organisations in Glasgow like Flourish House, Glasgow Centre for Inclusive Living, the Mental Health Network, and People First, organisations that are run by disabled people for disabled people, being a lifeline to disabled people during this time. At the announcement of lockdown, things went mad in Glasgow around social care. The first stat that we heard reported by the BBC was 1,884 social care packages were cut. We now know that that's over 2,000, and there were extreme pressures on social care, already a very fragile system in Glasgow, under-resourced across the country and actually across the UK. So people went into isolation, workers went off sick, some workers went to look after their family who were shielding. So you can understand that there were pressures, but that has left disabled people absolutely devastatingly in need of the care and the support that they need around having a shower, having medication, having food, using the loo, basic human rights stripped away, and people left with nothing. Again, isolation's been terrible, and the kind of digital exclusion side of things, just at a time when we're more relying on IT, has been even more challenging. So I think the stat that we have on that at the moment has actually slightly improved. So in our first study, we uncovered that 37% of people at that point were not connected. Were connected. So it was 63, is that right? 63% weren't, but that has actually gone up, and it's now 55% of people who are not connected. And we think it's partly because we got a grant and we bought equipment and we've been doing the digital coaching, but we also hadn't reached everybody at the point that we did the first study. So there has been a slight improvement, but it's still pretty bad. 54% of people, or 55% rather, not having the access. And there's going to be long-term impacts here around work, around volunteering, around education, around independent living, around all of the things that we've discussed, that I've discussed already: social care, social security, and I know Sally's going to pick up on some of that. So throughout the 13 weeks, GDA is built on our infrastructure as a grassroots community of interest. And what we've done is we've empowered disabled people in Glasgow as best we can in the circumstances to access vital information, support and services that are needed to increase their resilience during this global crisis, and now to consider what must happen to protect disabled people's human rights and embed their lived experience in co-designing the new normal, whatever normal is. Just finishing up with a few reflections. Our rapid response has been supported by emergency grants to bring in additional resources, and that's including staffing, food, communication, equipment, etc. We literally doubled our team between bringing in people to help us with the wellbeing surveyors. This is all casual workers coming in to help, and personal assistants delivering food and medication, and a couple of new posts that are just starting as well. We were also overwhelmed with offers of support from volunteers and from people who were allies and friends to GDA, but we were struck too by the lack of joined up working for disabled people and by how easy it was to fall through the cracks. How can it be that GDA is providing food to over 500 people if the shielding services were working? Or is it that the shielding group didn't have all the right people in it, and we know that that is true? They say in Glasgow that they've had shielding and shielding plus, and we know it was a massive, massive challenge. The leader of Glasgow City Council spoke at our event on Friday and described it as the biggest operational and logistical challenge which local authorities had ever had to respond to, in her knowledge, and she thought probably in history. Both Susan Aitken and the Minister for Equalities recognised that mistakes have been made and lessons must be learned, which is true, but it doesn't always happen in situations of chaos where the aim of the majority is to get back to their kind of normal, and normal never worked for disabled people in the first place because the world was basically designed without us in mind. So a key learning point of all of this is that although we're all in the same storm, we were definitely not and are definitely not all in the same boat. Everyone caught in the storm needs a lifeline that can pull them out of danger when they need it most, but for disabled people there are fewer lifelines within reach. Lockdown has shown that the inequalities disabled people face are sometimes too extreme to endure, such as social care, which is a fundamental human right, and poverty, which, as we know, is not inevitable. It's about choices, and choices must be made with more pressure and noise being made about the economic recovery and pressures. So, for example, pubs reopening and beer gardens being started up seems to be causing more of a stir than 2,000 people's social care packages being cut. And that leaves disabled people with no support, as I said, to wash, to dress, to eat, all of these things that are basic human rights. GDA has shown that disabled people's organisations can provide an anchor and a lifeline to sustain disabled people during challenging times. But what about the people we don't know about, that we didn't reach, those that live in areas where there isn't a disabled person-led organisation to catch them when they fall through, when everything else lets them down? History is going to recount how we all responded to the coronavirus outbreak. We need to ensure that the story told demonstrates our commitment as a society to protecting everyone from harm, particularly those most at risk of the worst impacts of COVID. We must design policies and practices that provide security for every member of our society. And this cannot happen without the vital involvement of disabled people. And so our key recommendation from all of our engagement with thousands of disabled people is to take the supercharged inequalities and turn them around by supercharging the involvement, the meaningful involvement of disabled people, supported by disabled people's organisations and our networks, to ensure that we're not left even further behind and that our human rights are not further eroded or forgotten as we move towards recovery and renewal. I'll stop there.
That's great. Thanks very much, Tressa. I think we covered really a lot of the big key issues that we would want to, issues around isolation, around stress, about the impact on incomes, but also I think importantly you've highlighted there for us the rights, the issues around rights, whether that's to social care and to participation. Those are questions that I think undoubtedly we'll pick up on. I'd now like to turn to Chloe True from the Scottish Human Rights Commission, who's going to give us a perspective there. Chloe, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. So as Peter says, my name's Chloe. I'm the Participation Officer at the Scottish Human Rights Commission. If you are kind of new to the Commission and you don't know much about us, we were set up back in 2008 to protect and promote human rights across Scotland. We're independent of Parliament and government. We're quite a small team. We're a small team of lawyers, policy officers, participation staff like myself, and we're led by our chair, Judith Robertson. So really listening to what Tressa has been speaking about the experiences of disabled people across Glasgow has resonated a lot with, I think, the first part of what I'm going to say today, which is a bit about how we have seen disabled people being affected at the Commission, and I'll talk a bit about some of our participation work. And then in the second half, what I'd really like to do is just make a couple of suggestions around what needs to happen for us to do the kind of process of building back better and having a kind of rights-based recovery to avoid some of those impacts that we saw after the financial crash in terms of the austerity measures and the way that those really affected specific groups of people much more severely than others, including disabled people, including Black and minority ethnic groups and women as well. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to start with just some of the experiences of one of the groups of people that we support. It's a small group of people. We call it the Adequate Standard of Living Reference Group, and they have been working together for probably the last 5 years. So they're really experts in mobilising rights and using rights to kind of influence change around some of the policies and procedures that we have in connection with poverty. And that group, I think because that group has worked together for quite a long time, they were able to quite quickly pull together some of the responses around what was happening to them on the ground, and pull together a kind of reflection on that, and we put that into the Scottish Parliament's Equality and Human Rights Committee last month. So if it's something that you want to look into a bit more, it's on our website, and I think it will also be on the committee's page as well. So just to say, it's obviously much smaller in scale than the kind of frankly amazing work that GDA has done. And also I know that Inclusion Scotland have been doing a significant amount of finding out what's happening to disabled people across Scotland through their surveys as well. But unsurprisingly, there are lots of commonalities really between the experiences of people in the reference group and those surveys. Many of the members of that reference group identify as disabled, and the kind of core points that they've kind of really been picking up on really reflect, I think that last slide of Tressa's where she was talking about the kind of different experiences, but their sort of number one priority was around mental health and just the impact of some of the restrictions, and also on social distancing as well, on the way that they felt about themselves, upon their kind of ability to access the supports and the activities and the experiences which they would normally use to kind of keep well. And that sense of isolation has been really difficult. The other point that they raised, again, which Tressa has spoken about, is just how narrowly drawn those criteria around shielding were, and how they kind of failed to recognise that just because somebody might not be kind of adversely affected by the virus, although I think actually it's quite difficult to say that with any kind of certainty given what we've seen, doesn't mean that they don't need kind of support, and doesn't mean that they don't need support to access food and kind of other essentials, which again is what we've seen. So they didn't really kind of take into account either the social model of disability or people's right to independent living, and that was really striking. So then connected to that is everything we know about social care across Scotland being withdrawn, in some cases being withdrawn overnight with no notice, with very little discussion for people. And you know, that's in spite of some of the recommendations from the UN around how that's such an important support for people to live independently, and that it's not something that should be restricted, and that also that there are kind of quite clear standards and recommendations from the UN about how disabled people need to be supported through emergency situations as well. So one of the other things that we saw as a group was that sometimes the inequalities were really quite extreme and were really quite difficult for people to cope with. So I'm thinking particularly around disabled people who might need access to physical support, basically, and specifically people with visual impairments, so blind people who require a kind of guide. And it's been the experience in our group certainly that there's been kind of very little understanding about the kind of support that people need, and people have been made subject to some really quite unpleasant and hurtful commentaries about why they're out, why they need support from somebody to go to the shops, and it's put people in really difficult positions. And I know that that's something that's been reflected in the recent survey by Disability Equality Scotland as well, and Max. So some of that has felt like a step back for people, and I think again that has impacted on people's mental health. So the other issue, I suppose, is around digital exclusion and digital exclusion of specific communities as well, and that's made it really hard for people to really, I guess, find the information that they need, connect into services that might be useful for them, but also just in terms of stuff like food poverty, that was really difficult. So we had examples of members who were not able to get out to the shops to top up their card, for example, because they were shielding, didn't have credit on the phone to kind of call the electricity company, were digitally excluded from things like smart meters that would have made that a bit easier. So all of those different impacts, the way that those impacts are felt by specific groups, and then even within specific groups differently, have been really drawn out. And you know, the group has been really concerned about other things such as domestic violence, and how people are being supported to kind of leave difficult relationships, and how that might particularly be affecting specific groups of people, and also about how workers' rights are supported, and do people have the right access to PPE, for example? Are people being protected to do these really important frontline services? So it was really quite a wide-ranging sort of discussion of some of the rights, and that's some of the impact that we've seen. But in terms of what we should do, I guess I wanted to start with a kind of a recommendation from that group of people, and I think it's really clear that it's also the kind of recommendation from GDA's members around the meaningful participation of people who are affected by issues in making some of the decisions. And I guess I think we've seen decisions having to be taken really quickly, without consultation with kind of relevant groups of people about how they're to be affected, and we can see that playing out in all sorts of ways. So that sort of return to a kind of more command and control style of government hasn't necessarily been that helpful, although there have of course kind of been pockets of good practice as well. So I guess that would be kind of my number one recommendation around how we can build back better, because I think in Scotland we still don't have a kind of systematic approach to participation, which is a human right after all. It's set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other treaties, so it's an obligation upon governments to deliver that. And I think it's really disappointing because I guess we've had some really great examples of good practice, you know, whether that's from disabled people's organisations, whether that's from the experience of people in poverty or care experienced people. they're really kind of showing the way to do things and taking the lead. And there's some real opportunities, I think, to learn from those initiatives across government or at health and social care partnership level or at local authority level. So, you know, why isn't that participation happening is the question. I think because participation is hard. It's hard work, it's time consuming, it's resource intensive, it's extremely challenging to some internal cultures. It doesn't fit into kind of neat policy timetables either. So it's often viewed as something that's actually just too costly to do. But I think actually what we need to argue is the converse, that actually it's much more costly not to do it effectively. So kind of enabling people's knowledge and experience to form part of our decision making, it helps us to avoid that kind of one-size-all thinking. It enables us to support people's dignity and autonomy and just make better strategic decisions and choices because we actually understand the problem rather than thinking that we understand the problem, which can be an issue, but also that there are solutions out there that wouldn't necessarily have been otherwise recognised. So I think one of the reasons it doesn't happen is because it changes the balance of power, and that can be tense and that can be really difficult. And I think if you're doing participation meaningfully, it should be tense and difficult, because tension is kind of where problems are solved. And sometimes I think we're a bit frightened of having those conversations, but actually that's what we should be doing. So I guess that's my first point on a recovery. And I guess it really speaks to the kind of other key message that I want to make, which is that recovery has to be grounded in rights effectively. So we have rights treaties like the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and they make a brilliant outcomes framework, really. So if we start with them, they can help to guide us to what we want to achieve and what we want to see, but also principles that underpin rights. So principles like participation can make for really robust processes. And I think probably the last few weeks have been a bit disappointing in seeing that all of the progress that we thought we had made in kind of embedding the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities and other human rights treaties into some of our strategic thinking has sort of felt like it's gone a bit by the wayside, and hasn't really played a role in maybe some of the ethical frameworks and some of the guidance that we've seen in relation, for example, to social care. So we need to kind of bring that discussion back in. So there's kind of two sort of legislative and policy actions that I guess at the Commission we would want to see in relation to a recovery. So the first one is about increasing the legal protections that we have in our law here in Scotland, and the second one is about budgets. So law and budgets, I know that's what you came for, exciting stuff. So thinking about the first of those, we have some really good legal protections for our civil and political rights in Scots law. So we have those through the Human Rights Act, and they protect rights in the European Convention. So things like free expression, assembly, the right to life, the right to private and family life. So we've got good protections. That's not to say the accountability mechanisms couldn't sometimes be improved, because I think that they could. But when we come to look at some of the rights that have really been impacted, and Tressa gave a brilliant outline of them. So in terms of food, in terms of poverty and adequate standard of living, in terms of the right to live independently, we don't have any direct legislative protections for those in our law. And that's something that needs to change. So these rights sit quite high up in international treaties, like the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities and some other treaties that also protect specific rights, but also the rights of specific groups of people. And they really need to come down into our domestic law. So we've had some good commitments by the First Minister to take that forward. And there's currently a task force that's working on looking at actually how do we do that? What are the processes that we use to include those rights into our law? As something that really needs to happen, so that, for example, people could take a case to court around the right to food or the right to live independently, where they thought that some of the decisions hadn't been particularly good. So it would increase the accountability. But probably the main advantage of putting those protections in law is that it means that public authorities and governments have to think about those things much earlier in the policy-making process. So they have to look at human rights standards, and they have to try and implement those. So there's lots of standards across the different human rights issues, which can really help us to make good policy. And that is really vital, because we've seen sort of relatively good progress, I would say, in embedding some of the kind of CRPD, so Convention on Rights of Persons with Disability Rights, in high-level strategy, but that hasn't filtered down into practice. So there's not really any purpose in us talking about, for example, fair work, the right to fair work, or the right to independent living, if at the point of implementation, if at the point where we're maybe having a social care assessment, or there's a resource being allocated to us, whatever form that would take under self-directed support. If those concepts are meaningless because actually the driving force is budgets, then that's what needs to change effectively. So speaking of budgets, that's my kind of final point for a kind of better recovery. So budgets and the Scottish budget, more than anything, are an expression of what we think of is important. So they're an expression of kind of our values. So it's nice to say nice things, but actually, are we funding resources? Are we providing resources to implement change? So one of the things that we need to do is ensure that the kind of outcomes and the goals of the Scottish budget are in the service of rights effectively. So that, you know, whether that's kind of right to independent living, or right to food, or the right to social security, etc. So rights should really shape our goals, what we want to achieve with our kind of budget, but also the processes that we use. So one of the things that the Commission recently did, my amazing colleague Ali, is to look at the way that budget processes work, and to kind of look at a set of indicators about what makes a good budget. And that includes things like openness and transparency and public participation. And she did that according to a kind of already set out methodology that's accepted by the World Bank and the IMF and those kinds of organisations. So Scotland came out really well on oversight, but we fell far short on measures of openness and participation. So the people who are actually most affected by resource allocation don't get to have a huge amount of say in budget setting. So that's one of the things that the Commission would want to see change, is to see citizens participate much more in pre-budget stages, and also to have like accessible information and more of a say about how our resources are generated. So are we taking tax in a way that's fair? Are we allocating resources in a way that supports rights and it also is not leading to kind of further unjust outcomes? And are we spending the money actually, which is sometimes not the case. So all of those things are really important, and especially when we look at what happened after the 2008 financial crisis and the kind of austerity that came after that, but also where the Scottish Government has received significant extra monies to deal with coronavirus. So how can we use that budget to support rights, basically? So that's really my main topics. I mean, I've talked a little bit about recovery, and I've talked about the need for a rights-based recovery, increased participation in budgeting, and increasing the accountability for economic and social cultural rights like food, like social security and law. So all of those things are kind of really key issues of a rights-based approach, and that's what we would want to see as the Commission in this kind of Build Back Better phase. So that's me.
Thanks very much, Chloe. Again, really covering in quite a lot of depth in a short space of time some of the big issues around rights and disabled people, and I think importantly, I think a message there that rights have essentially been deprioritised during this part of the crisis. So we need to change that, and perhaps we need to think about how we can practically do that in the future. I'll now turn to Dr. Sally Witcher. Sally, as most of you will know, is Chief Exec at Inclusion Scotland, and I'll turn over to her now for our final contribution. Over to you, Sally.
Hello everyone, can you hear me okay? I'm sorry, this is my first webinar, so you may have to excuse me as I faff about here. I'm going to first say just a few words about Inclusion Scotland, who we are and what we do, in case you're not familiar with us. So we're a kind of national intermediary, an organisation led by disabled people, which is important because it is disabled people who know what barriers are, because we live them every day. We have reached right across Scotland and have been doing a lot of work trying to gather experiences across Scotland. We have a project in the Highlands, and that's been really interesting in kind of pulling out some of the kind of particular impacts in different parts of Scotland as well. We have a very long track record in policy work and internships, delivering internships in all sectors. We have projects around access to politics, lived experience leadership. We do a lot around engagement methods. We've established a kind of people-led policy panel model and have had one working on social care support for some time, kind of co-producing and co-designing adult social care support. They're now involved in some of the work around the responses. And we're kind of informed by the social model, which means we see disability as not being about impairment, but about the attitudes, environment, and all the external factors that don't accommodate us. We promote independent living, by which we mean choice and control, not fending for yourself, and we're very much rooted in human rights. So I'm going to try and not reiterate what other speakers have already put extremely well. But there's a lot that I could say about findings around the impact on disabled people, but Tressa and the people at Tressa and the Purple Poncho players have already articulated that really well. Apart from the fact there are some particular issues in other parts of Scotland which are probably were definitely worth being aware of. I'm going to take a step back, if that's okay, and just sort of look a bit at the bigger picture. And I was really struck by a book I'm reading at the moment, and a not altogether cheery read on surveillance capitalism. And it said something along the lines of, if we persist in looking at radically new developments through the old frames of reference, we're not going to understand them, and we're not going to be able to react and respond appropriately. So I want to think a bit about how this whole debate about the new normal, what this new future is going to look like, how it's being framed, and who's building it, the context, and some of the kinds of, not just the supercharged inequalities, which are definitely there, but also the scope for new inequalities to be created, because I think that's also what we're seeing. I mean, again, we need to understand what these new inequality fault lines look like if we're going to be able to respond, and if governments are going to be able to respond as well. So to begin with, the question of how this debate is being framed. So it's a question of what kind of future are we building? Who is we? Who's building it? And despite the strapline build back better, do we want to build back? Because the old normal really didn't work for a very large number of people. And so maybe what we want to do is to build forwards. And maybe we want to build bottom up, build better bottom up. And that's something that Inclusion Scotland has been very keen to promote. The risk is that if you have lots of absolutely excellent people, the great and good, the leaders in all different aspects of society, who are basically framing and inventing this new future, will they have the knowledge? Will they have the lived experience about what really needs to change? And I think our view is that with the best will in the world, that may not be the case. So it's also a question about word and language. We don't much like the word normal. It can be quite excluding, and so there's some issues here about language too. If we are going to build better bottom up, there are some real challenges, as Chloe has touched on, about how we do this in a way that's meaningful, that really does reach people who don't have a voice, but whose voices very much need to be not just part of this debate, but leading it in many respects. It's also about taking an intersectional approach. We recently published some research on intersectional discrimination, which called Services for Who. And this really highlighted how, obviously one size doesn't fit all, but it's about also some of the structural and system-based issues that simply don't work for people with combinations of protected characteristics. So if we're going to look at the context, obviously the focus is on COVID-19, but I think we ignore at our peril the fact that there are other major issues around, like Brexit and climate change. So the kind of disasters we're seeing at the moment is not just a one-off, and it is going to intersect with these other things. And therefore, whatever this inverted commas new normal looks like, it isn't going to be normal, and it is going to be very turbulent and ever-changing. We also need to understand the starting point for all this for disabled people, but also many others. And that is that social care is already in a state of crisis. that there are long-standing, deeply entrenched inequalities around employment, poverty, housing, you name it. And that because of this, clearly, because of what's happened, the resilience in as far as both individuals and support systems are concerned, it isn't there. It's already been cut to the bone and beyond. So there's no slack there to draw on whatsoever. And increasing demand for already inadequate provision. And what's happened, I think, with this, with the arrival of COVID, is that there has, and I think there's understandably, been a focus on kind of frontline damage limitation, a kind of food parcel level of response. And it's also led to a very rapid pace of policy development, which poses real challenges for meaningful engagement and for quality policy and responses. And those are all factors in the way that we go about designing how we respond. One of the things Inclusion Scotland is actively looking at is about designing a new kind of engagement framework method that is going to enable people with lived experience who are very much excluded and whose voices aren't heard, about how we reach them, you know, and how we make sure we're not leading that, and how we set the framework that enables them to lead, and not just inform what other people are doing. It needs to be more than that. In a sense, it's maybe what other people are doing, other commissions and so on. Sorry, excuse me, my phone has chosen this moment to go off. Would you just, sorry, Peter, can I?
That's not a problem at all.
Oh, the joys of working from home, excuse me. Right, I hopefully killed it, but it may make a second attempt. Okay, so now I've totally lost my thread. Yeah, so yeah, it is about how we set up, and it is challenging, but it can be done, and we may need to work with other, and we'd like to work potentially with other organisations, working with other groups to make sure that this can be a wider ranging response. So what I think we have on the horizon is ongoing turbulence, turbocharged austerity, turbocharged privatisation, which is kind of hollowing out of democracy and democratic constraints, turbocharged acceleration of poverty and inequality, because the impact of disaster is not evenly spread, as we know. But I think it's also important to recognise that there are some people out there, very wealthy people, who are going to profit very greatly from this disaster. And there's also just something which is, given my current reading, is uppermost in my mind. It's about turbocharged surveillance and behaviour management and manipulation. So those are just some of the kind of big picture stuff. So I want to quickly move on then to talk about, I mentioned earlier what I think are the, if you like, the new emerging inequality fault lines and some of the redrawing of the boundaries between inclusion and exclusion. So what we're seeing is a whole new kind of layer of different sorts of risk around at the moment. So clearly there are risks around having a health condition, but it's also risks about the nature of responses and who responses and support are targeted at as driven by health condition. And one of the very big concerns for us, and I think Tressa mentioned it, or people, the Purple Pottery players did, there are a lot of people we know who are at extremely great risk, but who are not in the shielding group, who are not getting the support, and whose predicament, if they're in paid work, when furlough ends, could be really, really significant. You know, it's about what kind of risk are you going to take? What are you going to risk your health and your life, or are you going to risk your money? And that is simply not a choice that anyone should be forced into making. But whilst the focus has so firmly been on health condition as the kind of the indication of risk, and there's all kinds of inequalities around these divisions between shielding, non-shielding and others that I've already touched on, there are all kinds of other risks here that could result in new inequality fault lines, as I'm calling them. So those include things like the nature of any support you need for daily living. in terms of things like physical proximity, duration and frequency, the numbers of people providing it and their risk status as per a whole range of variables, which I'm going to rattle through, the implications of not getting that support and how quickly new and changing essential support needs can be put into place. Because as we move into the next stage of sort of testing and protecting and tracking and so on, it could be that people need to be put in to kind of basically isolate very fast. And if people have support needs anyway, or this is going to require support needs, and I think disabled people are going to be particularly adversely impacted there, we need to think about what systems are going to deliver that in a timely way. The other kind of very big factor here, and that's why I think Inclusion Scotland's kind of role as a national organisation hopefully is going to be something, enable us to add something, important to this debate, is geography. Because we're going to be seeing probably, we think, local outbreaks. We already know that there are rural and remote versus urban type factors, things around population density, distances to travel, proximity of home to essential services, pre-existing deprivation in terms of areas and neighbourhoods, and so on. Another very big one is around the nature of any paid work. Can it be done from home or can't it? Who do you interact with? The numbers of people that you interact with, how changeable they are, and things around the location of work and the extent you have to travel, and so on. Then, of course, there's your sort of home setting. If you're in a closed institution, there could be particular risks, and we've seen the extent of outbreak within care homes, and there are also sort of implications for anybody in that kind of closed setting should the virus enter into that space. Things around household makeup, because the issues here are for family carers, and people are becoming family carers who never were before. Family carers who've been around for a long time and have been for a long time under-supported are now in a very difficult situation, deeply fearful of what happens if they become ill. Certainly issues around for children and disabled children. The impact on disabled parents, parents of disabled children, has been absolutely catastrophic. And I don't use these words lightly, because of the lack of support, particularly when children with additional support needs came out and were back in the home without any support. So, and then there's another factor about just how everybody else behaves and whether they practice, hygiene measures, wear masks, etc. So all of these things are potential sort of, if you like, this sort of, as I've talked about, I've called them fault lines for want of a better way. It's about how different groups of people start to get divided and segmented, and how people, do people have the information to gauge their own risk along such factors? And frankly, at the moment, they really don't. And then there's the whole nature of how it's not just COVID that is creating risk, it's responses to it that are not just creating risk, but also inequalities. So we need to be really mindful of that and think about very carefully about how we're ensuring that people are not being effectively discriminated against because they don't happen to fit into a narrow, administratively defined category. Interestingly though, everyone, I suppose, in some ways has had a wee taste of disability, about what it's like to not be able to go where you want to go, when you want to go there, do what you want to do. And what we've seen is that things that we've previously been told were completely impossible, couldn't be done, have happened. So flexible remote working has become, widespread practice in all kinds of areas. We've seen money pumped into social care and the NHS. Online technology has, much as it has increased the digital divide in some respects, has also opened up access for many, and there are even fears that some of the things that have come into play, and some of the opportunities to kind of interact through the new technology may cease to apply once other people go back, and so-called normality resumes. Maybe there is greater understanding, maybe there has been, but there's a bit of a care dynamic here. I actually heard on the radio this morning some guy saying about how a 97-year-old woman had phoned him to ask if he was okay and it shouldn't be the other way around. And I thought, well, why? Why? Because the thing is, you may need support, but that doesn't mean you aren't an active citizen and that you don't have equality in that way. And there is some, much as it's been fantastic to see the kind of sense of solidarity and so on, we do need to be a little cautious about some of the kind of power dynamics that can get set up here, which actually mitigate very much against equality. And so in terms of policy, and I know that time is really tight, and what can be done. Well, social security, I'm not even going to go through the well-rehearsed arguments on the inadequacy of university credit and reserved provision, because we know what they are. We've known them for a long time, and their inadequacies now are just writ large. Scottish government clearly has some devolved powers, but I'm not sure that they have as much scope to act as may be recognised. Perhaps they're more constrained by things like the extent to which benefits give passports to others, and obviously around means testing and people relocating and so on, implications there. So there's a lot to do with the interface between devolved and reserved benefits that actually do tie Scottish Government's hands in ways that are potentially quite counterproductive. Quite a lot of debate about universal basic income, and that is one worth looking at, but it is not simple. And we had what we call a pop-up think tank a while ago, did a report on some of the implications for disabled people, and the fact that disabled people do have extra costs, and there are and other groups do as well, to achieve an equivalent living standard. When it comes to employment, the Scottish Government declared an ambition to halve the employment gap. But I think it's fair to say that progress on that has been really limited. And a lot of the old approaches have just been rehashed, and they're delivering pretty much what they always did, which is nothing like enough or good enough. And as I've already flagged, the situation for people at very high risk, but also for employers, and including, of course, disabled employers, and the need for guidance for employers and support for people in that situation. With the end of furlough, I think is going to be a major factor. Disabled people are likely to be disproportionately represented in the sectors of work that will be adversely affected, and I think there's real scope for increased discrimination in recruitment, and that's something we need to keep very alert to. We need a national social care support system free at the point of use. We needed it before, we need it now, we desperately need it now. This is a human right. This is not something that is subject to local variables and priorities. People have a human right, not just to stay alive, but live their lives, and they've been denied that for way too long. And I hope that now the case for this has gained some momentum. In particular, there needs to be a focus on mental health support services, given what our survey identified as a mental health emergency amongst disabled people, and particular support for disabled children and their parents. Inclusive communications has never been more important, and its absence, where there has been an absence, and there has never been more significant. Because it doesn't matter how great the guidance is, if it's not in a format you can understand it when you need it, you're not going to know what's going on. And at a time of crisis, it's extremely important that people get information they need. There has to be a focus on digital connection and access, and I've already sort of flagged implications for equalities and the Equalities Act, and how reasonable adjustments are going to be affected by this. So could it be that the fact that people can can watch a theatre performance online becomes used as a reasonable adjustment, so that theatres don't have to actually change their premises to make them accessible? So, quite a lot of questions about how that's going to play out. We recently launched a tender, or it was for expressions of interest, for some work around scoping incorporation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That was in partnership with the Alliance, because that is something which we need to do as one way of embedding it into Scots law. And I think there's also, I've actually understood now for the first time why, having read this book, the data protection legislation is actually so important, having resisted it massively with all the burdens and bureaucracy. There is some real issues here about protection of privacy. And thinking about how people in poverty generally are much more surveyed, their behaviour and conditionality and so on is a long-standing feature of social security. Scope for even greater monitoring and tracking and behaviour modification. I think it should really signal alarm bells. And I don't actually think I may be wrong. I'm not sure how on people's agendas it is. Finally, it's not just Scottish Government and UK governments that need to be doing things here. In fact, in some ways, it's questionable quite what and how they can do, and whether it's really what we think they can do. Local authorities and local action are really important. Employers, service providers of all kinds, private sector retailers, and more generally architects, transport providers and others. So maybe one of the things we need to consider is how we make sure that in the way that we engage in this, we are looking wider than just governments. Yes, look at them too, but not exclusively. So I'm way out of time, but that's kind of pretty much sums up what I wanted to say. I'm sorry it's not a slightly more optimistic message, but I do think we have to look we really do need to look in a hard, objective way about the situation we're in if we stand the slightest hope of coming up with some positive outcomes here.
Thanks very much, Sally. It was a really powerful discussion. I think we have to be realistic about the significant challenges we face. If I could ask all of our speakers to put their cameras back on, and what we'll do, we're obviously running over time a little bit just now, but what we can try and do is perhaps just get through a few of the key questions that have come up. Obviously, all three of you have raised incredibly important issues, and that's what our task was today, is to raise these issues. As I said earlier, we will continue to follow these up in the weeks and months ahead, and I think hopefully this lays the basis for all of our organisations and for wider civil society to be working together on some of these questions. I'm going to pick some questions that have been asked throughout the morning so far, and maybe just throw them out to you just to see what kind of answers you might be able to come up with. I think everyone has talked about the need to find ways to better involve and to actively involve, meaningfully involve disabled people in planning. What are some of the specifics? And I guess, Sally, you had touched on it, and Chloe also, but what are some of the things that we could maybe look to see there? And I don't know, maybe Tressa to come in as well, particularly picking up on Sally's final point there around the importance of the local authority level as well. I mean, what are some of the steps we need to see? So we had a question about the extent to which disabled people have been involved in planning so far, and I think we know about the advisory group on economic recovery and a lot of the criticism that was levelled when that was first set up, and there are other similar types of groups that have been set up where there have been criticisms. But what can we practically do? What are some of the steps that we need to take to ensure that disabled people are actively involved in planning some kind of better future? Whoever would like to go first on that one, big question. Oh, Tressa, you're muted.
Just, I suppose, just because you've mentioned the kind of local authority level, I think a really interesting fact is that we're heavily involved in lots of structures and lots of ways of feeding in to the local authority, but one area that we're just not, there's no formal connection, is with the Health and Social Care Integrated Joint Board, and that's, you know, clearly something that an organisation with 5,000 members as Glasgow Disability Alliance has. We do have a perspective. We have a social care expert group, very like the model of the people-led policy panel that Inclusion Scotland has. We've got lots of intel. Sometimes we find it easier to influence Scottish Government than it is to influence a local authority. and the local authority is really where the influence needs to happen. It needs to happen at both levels, of course, but it really needs to be, the participation needs to be happening in the area, in the local area where the services are being designed and delivered. And that's just very difficult. So that's just one example of where I think we should be feeding in. And we are feeding in a lot of ways across a lot of areas, but that's one area that we're not really. It's usually by exception. So we hear an issue's coming up and we write to councillors and members of the Integrated Joint Board. We turn up at the meetings, but it's not routine. We don't have any representation or real way to influence the board.
Is there anything that we can take from the experience of the response to COVID-19? I guess, Sally, you had mentioned that, you know, some of what we've learned, you know, that sense of everyone's had a wee taste of what disability is like, and also the we've recognised now the speed with which some things can change when they need to. Is there anything that we can take around that participation agenda, whether it's using online communications like this, that creative policymakers should really be looking at to better involve disabled people?
So just quickly to say, in terms of involvement so far, when all this broke, I don't think we were involved, and disabled people. I mean, it just wasn't, because the focus was on emergency, just trying to turn around the whole social care system, which, let's face it, is not a straightforward prospect. And therefore there was an awful lot of firefighting. One of the things about meaningful engagement is that it can take time. It can require capacity building. Inclusion Scotland has a lot of people and is involved with a variety of different projects where we have access to people who do have some capacity built, if you like, and who kind of may be quite a useful place to start. But I think it's also about, you know, and also to say that right now it's gone from that to us being bombarded by requests for equality impact assessments by like midday tomorrow. You know, that's again poses all kinds of challenges. The reality of the situation is that this is happening at a really fast pace. The question I have is whether some of these things needs to happen at a slower pace, and whether actually there's some value as well as trying to kind of influence what's happening now, to trying to just sort of sit back and just catch our breaths a bit and not be dragged along by all of this. And it's a question, really. I think it's a bit of both. I think it requires a repositioning and a slightly different understanding of the role of third sector organisations, because what I've seen is you know, the traditional charity model has suddenly resurged. It's about you know, food parcels. It's about the kind of going to, you know, the kind of one-to-one. It's the kind of damage limitation model, if you like, of which charities have very often been positioned in you know, as providing. And I kind of think what we need now is much more of a sense of charities as a vehicle through which to reach people, to gather information, to kind of organise information and convey information. And it kind of implies a different role. And it's one that Inclusion Scotland has been exploring quite actively how we do that. And we have got some thoughts on that, but they're still, they're not quite at a point where I can share them. Not least of all because I would kind of like to know a bit about it before I start broadcasting things to the world. But there are some thoughts about this, and there have been conversations happening with other people around how collectively we might come up with some kind of structure that would enable that kind of, I don't much like the term bottom up much either, frankly, but that kind of input and that kind of, to allow this to emerge from the people for whom the previous situation didn't work, rather than those for whom it did. That's kind of, I think, the real challenge for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely, and it kind of echoes a question we've just had on the chat about how we do develop that collective response when the commitments to participation will once again fail. We can see the seeds of that failure already happening right now, I think. So I think that is part of the discussion that we need to keep alive over the coming weeks to better fashion a collective response to that challenge of participation. For one, just I recognise and I apologise to our participants that we've ran over a bit, but I think the discussion has been, the inputs have been fantastic. So I'm allowing us to run over a little bit just to get to a couple of other key questions. We had one around transport and what are some of how do we address some of the transport challenges that await us almost as lockdown starts to be lifted, with public transport's capacity, which was already not really fit for purpose in most areas of Scotland for disabled people. When that capacity is already reduced, and when the alternatives in terms of private car ownership and so on are excessively high for many disabled people, what are some of the solutions there? And just looking down my list of questions, which I should say to our participants, our speakers will get a summary of the questions, and we'll try and get as many answers to those over the next few days as we can. But just thinking about also the impact around work. So if we maybe just finish on those two issues, Sally, you again had touched on the implications around disabled people who are in employment and what the likely impact might be of the end of the furlough scheme, of just the consequences of the kind of economic dislocation that we're likely to see over the coming months. So a question there around transport and one around employment for anyone who wishes to take it first.
Shall I go?
Great.
Okay, so again, all the issues about transport are so well rehearsed, I'm not going to go through them again. And there are other organisations that lead on transport and accessible transport. But there are some, we've seen even like today, a big issue around face masks and face coverings that don't work for some disabled people. The other thing that we know is that that transport can be quite a focal point for hate crimes, for abuse. And I'm aware that there are surveys and data arising about instances of that. I have real fear that disabled people are not able to use face coverings. That is going to be seen as you know, it's going to prompt very abuse, and that is deeply worrying. The rise in hate crime against disabled people assuming that because you're visibly disabled you shouldn't be out, is already happening. So there's some new stuff arising around that, which I think we need to look really carefully at. On employment, I'm not sure that there's a lot more specific I can say, other than the fact that I think we're going to see is some really significant segmentation within the labour market, and that around what work can be done at home, what can't, very different risks associated and inequalities. But most of all, we've got to get into people's heads, because I think it's still not really there. The disabled people are in work. That people who are shielding very often are in work. They might even be key workers. They might be employers. They could be doing anything. And until that understanding is there, you're not going to get the support. We're not going to get the guidance. You know, and people are just going to be left high and dry. And there's so much to do to kind of change that perception of who disabled people are. We're not the vulnerable. We're active equal citizens. You know, we are anyone everywhere. And there's an awful lot of people with health conditions who are very much at risk of never identify as disabled. And there are disabled people who are at no more risk than anybody else. So let's get our heads around that. And then maybe we stand a hope of getting things right.
Tessa.
Yeah, I mean, Sally's articulated it beautifully, and I don't want to repeat what she said. I suppose in relation to employment, the kind of concern I have, kind of extending on from what she's saying, is just about disabled people were always at a disadvantage in employment because of discrimination. And now, if there's more people unemployed, those who were furthest down, you know, if you talk about the employability pipeline as being people who are maybe near work ready, people who are in work, and then the people at the lowest kind of rung of the ladder are the people who need quite a lot of capacity built in the first place to even get to think about employment, because all the kind of interrelated barriers and the structural inequalities that they face, those people are going to be even further removed. And it has occurred to us that the disability employment gap might look like it's improved because at the end of furlough, other people are going to be made redundant and more people are going to be in work, but actually in the medium to longer term, it's going to be much, much worse for disabled people.
Yeah. I think, thanks very much, Tressa. I think, unfortunately, I'd said an hour and we're now an hour and 15 minutes. There is clearly a lot more for us to discuss here. And we will. There's issues of rurality have come up in the Q&A, and issues around housing, which again are really important questions about participatory budgeting. These are topics and issues that we'll continue to focus on, and we want to bring again, as Sally had mentioned, that intersectional approach to this, so we don't see any of these questions in isolation or disconnected or special for one group of people over another. Over the weeks to come, we will return to some of these questions. The questions we've had today, we'll send round to our speakers, and we'll try and get some answers and get those posted on our website, just so as we can complete this part of the discussion. Just want to thank again all three speakers today just for fantastic inputs. The purpose of these discussions is to really help us think through the big challenges that we face, and our speakers have all done that exceptionally well today. We will continue to follow these up, and as the Poverty Alliance, these will influence the kind of things that we're focused on, the kind of issues that we're campaigning and lobbying on as we try to come out of this crisis with something better than we've gone into it with. We're putting the final touches to the next tranche of webinars, and we'll have that ready to go in the next few days. So keep connected to us and keep checking our website. Those details will go up soon. But just to say thank you again to all our speakers, and we'll see you the next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.